Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Frames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren King, also known as ExoAcademian. Great to be back with all of you on this episode. We're going to get into some really interesting topics today, Darren. And before we do, I just wanted to say congratulations on the launch of Event Horizon with Janice. It was an excellent first episode. Really excited for what you guys are doing. You know, I've known this project was coming, so I couldn't say anything about it, but now that it's out there, I'm kind of fanboying and really impressed and excited to see what you guys create together. But other than Event Horizon, which I definitely want you to talk about and touch on, what else has been going on in your life?
Well, it sort of is an extension of what Event Horizon is about, in the sense that I just spend pretty much all of my time tracking what's going on with the UFO phenomenon, what's going on amongst people who are sensing things, following the news and seeing various trends that are arising in our world, and how, again, that conflux of arising seems to be leading to something pretty important, pretty significant, hence the name Event Horizon. Really happy you enjoyed that one. Had some great response from people. And it also feels like I want to say, this really says to me that there's some sort of overarching orchestration going on. These things that happen, these people I meet, right? When I met you, and turned out we lived in the same city of all places in the world. And then when I met Janice, when I met people that I'm involved with at the John Mack Institute, people I've met in Europe that you're aware of that have been really key in my life as well. All of these feel very much like there's this synchronistic orchestration going on by some overarching arm of intelligence. And it's a pretty remarkable feeling to feel like you're caught up in the strength of that really powerful river.
Yeah, it is. It's and you hear this a lot, not just, you've mentioned it before. I've mentioned it a little bit, and we have friends that do shows and are also active in the community, and they certainly mention that too. And I think it feels a little bit different for everyone. Everyone has a slightly different experience of that. For me personally, you talked about sort of our connection and how we launched Liminal Frames, and all those things were really quite strange and profound for me, in part because I'd been listening to Point of Convergence for a long time before I even kind of put the pieces together that you were local to me. It's like almost like that part of it was obscured from my attention. And then all of a sudden, when it was made known, it was like this lightning bolt moment. It was like, well, wait a minute, this person is like right here. So really kind of a wild experience there. And on top of that, the way that I experience some of this content is, I guess, I don't use this term, but this is sort of what I feel like it's approximate to. It's sort of like downloads, where I'd be going about my day, might be pausing or thinking or just even spaced out to some degree, and then things just sort of appear or arrive to me as things that I think are important to talk about, to raise awareness on, to introduce into conversation. Those are ideas that in some ways either have been gestating like inside my own consciousness, I've just not been aware of them explicitly until that moment, or they've been almost like provided to me as opportunities for discussion or to raise or to bring into the greater awareness. So it's really interesting and weird how this whole process works, and I think it's just fun to be a part of that journey. And certainly with just having those moments over and over again is you get a little bit of a rush from it, quite frankly, because even though you feel that compulsion to talk about it or to act on it, you don't exactly know what will follow from it. And as you talked about before, acting on it and what follows is almost like far more interesting than the impulse itself.
Absolutely true. And it's so interesting as well because there's this kind of parallel process right now where each of us are having these individual revelations or downloads or sensings that arise that we feel the need to act on. While also in the more global scope, there are things happening in the world that also seem to be happening simultaneously that kind of partner with those things in some ways. So you have the kind of the micro and the macro happening at the same time. And then, in terms of what is happening with disclosure, for instance, which we're going to get into again today, and how that moves along, and even how, as many of us have had this experience of having our worldviews blown wide open and reconstituted in many ways in light of the experiences with the phenomenon, we're seeing now the mainstream and politicians and academics begin to have to grapple with this as well. And I know many different kinds of mainstream journalists who would like to tame this in some way so it's more palatable to a mainstream audience, but it refuses to be tamed. And we're going to get into later even the testimony that was recently given in a pretty casual manner on an X/Twitter space by Jason Sands that speaks to this, the sense that here's a person with really credible, intelligence background, military service over decades, saying some pretty amazing things that to some people really stretch credibility. So this is where we're at, not just in our individual lives and in our friendships, but also as a planet, as a civilization, trying to make sense of these things in the midst of some pretty overwhelming circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just think, I think everyone can relate to this to some degree. We all tend to approach life with this sort of kind of rational skeletal structure of what it's supposed to look like and how it's supposed to be. And then all of a sudden, like, that gets penetrated and broken by these events or experiences or epiphanies or whatever you want to call them. They break us out of that normal sort of locked in way of thinking about our track. And they, as I've used this word before, compel us into an alternate track of acting, being, and existence. And I find that to be really interesting because it absolutely ties in with what we saw happen with Jason Sands on that X space. You got the sense that he felt compelled to get it out there. It wasn't like the way that anybody would have wanted that information to be disclosed. And here we have that dichotomy again. It's sort of this is what I expect to happen. This is what I would want to happen if it were to be, quote unquote, official or have more credibility. And then this is what actually happens. And what actually happens disrupts that credible expectation and then causes us to wrestle with the absurdity of it all. It kind of shakes us out of that almost hypnotic trance that we are in, thinking that life is going to kind of unfold in front of us in a certain set manner, and then shakes us out of that. And by being shook out of that lock-in, we're open to then this new sort of reality that kind of allows to penetrate that and expand our experience of what we thought was okay or normal or what would be. So really interesting stuff, and just seeing it happen on multiple different levels is really quite interesting.
It is, and then you've also got the track what we are following, and all of us in UFO Twitter land are following, and that is the political march towards disclosure or the stalling along the way, right? So much of what's come out in recent news is that people who seemed to be pretty gung-ho before are not so gung-ho now, which raises all sorts of questions. Some people who are skeptical to begin with will just say, see, there was nothing there after all. People who are familiar with the tactics used by the DoD and whatnot historically to slow this down are asking questions about have people been, quote unquote, gotten to, right? Because of what we've seen historically. This is happening again in real time. And it is fascinating. And to your point about how the Jason Sands things rolled out and how it wasn't really what was crafted in terms of how this should ideally come out. It's interesting when you look back at history because it's rife with those kinds of examples where what actually tipped things over was something really small, something unexpected, right? And this speaks to something Belay to some degree has spoken about before, that these major turning points, these things that emerge in the future, you can't predict. There's a certain kind of chaotic nature to this kind of thing, which again makes us think about certain future scenarios with the phenomenon. What if something that no one's anticipating is what really breaks this wide open? It could be. We are all playing sideline cheerleader in terms of how this is going to finally break into the mainstream, but it might very well be something that no one is anticipating.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we're going to get into, I think, a lot of the different ways that aspects of disclosure confront our expectations in this episode and what we feel is sort of okay or acceptable, what is not acceptable. Before we get into that, though, I do want to cover some of the current events. We've alluded to some of them just now and get into these topics just a little bit before we get into the full focus of the episode. So one, we had this FOIA release about the Eglin Air Force Base video that apparently there's this very contradictory set of statements here. We have AARO on the one hand essentially saying that what these pilots saw over Eglin Air Force Base was really just sort of balloons. It was lighting balloons that got unmoored from some photo shoot someplace and drifted up into the atmosphere and resulted in what the pilots were seeing. So a totally prosaic explanation, in other words. But then we have this FOIA release essentially saying that there is video of this event. I think AARO also said there wasn't video of it, but there is video of this event, and that they can't release the video because it's too sensitive to national security. And you kind of left there with your head scratching, like, which version of the truth is the right version? And I also know that Merrick did some investigative reporting on those lighting balloons themselves and found out that, the company that would have even provided them, like, it just wasn't feasible that would have happened. So it's all quite perplexing and just adds to this, I think, sense of frustration that the community has that AARO isn't really being straight with the American people, and whose side are they really on here? So what are your thoughts about that one?
Yeah, I said this after reading Merrick's article, which was really well done, as is usually the case with Merrick's article. He's one of the few people in the mainstream really championing this topic and really looking at the DoD's actions, looking at AARO's actions, and comparing it to the historical record. I said, quote, "There is the mysterious absurdity encountered as an aspect of the phenomenon, and then there is a completely different kind of absurdity presented as, quote-unquote, prosaic explanations by the Pentagon," unquote. Because that's really what he gets to in this article, is just the degree of how preposterous this kind of argument they're making for what this could be in terms of these balloons that somehow are flying in formation, somehow can pause in midair even though there was a pretty stiff wind that day, those kinds of things. Like you say, Merrick went the extra mile and called the maker of these supposed balloons, and they said there's no way this could be the case. The arguments that are made are so ridiculous that even someone with just a basic sense of rationality would look at the arguments and say it doesn't fit the facts of the case. And again, what's ironic here is that AARO said there apparently was no video to look at anyway. And then we find out from this FOIA request, I guess, that there was indeed a video, but it has been classified, won't be released for various reasons, even though the event itself doesn't seem particularly eventful or classified. So there's all sorts of interesting questions. But this speaks to something that we as parents find out with our kids, and they eventually find out about it. If you start lying, you have to tell additional lies to cover up the lies. And eventually, it's just a big, complicated, contradictory mess that doesn't fit together. I think that's what we're seeing right now, is that while AARO, as a branch of the DoD, is trying to shut this down, the way that they're trying to do it is not even fitting together nicely anymore, and people are able to call it out in real time.
Yeah, and we're seeing the return of the Weaponized podcast with Jeremy and George. And they've certainly come out full force against what they've seen happen with AARO, and also talking about Kona Blue and how it's another contradiction in AARO's narrative there, that people were coming forward saying, that they knew about these programs because they were in Kona Blue, and AARO was saying, like, that's why these can't be trusted. But the Kona Blue program never even got off the ground, never was even something that someone could be a part of. So another contradiction from the AARO narrative. They also are, highlighting the fact that they're hearing from more and more both civilian and military pilots, and kind of hinting that the stigma is really continuing to lessen as more reports are being shared. And so you really have, I guess we're coming up on this interesting conjunction of a repeated official narrative about there's nothing to see here, yet more and more public interest and awareness and the butting of heads of these different stories. Something has to give. And I think, as Gary Nolan has pointed out, others have pointed out, we just need more transparency from the Department of Defense here. Like, they are controlling the entire narrative and not giving us any of the substance behind their conclusions. So we're just sort of left taking them at their word, which is essentially what got us in this place to begin with. Years and years, decades of just taking them at their word, and then later on finding out that there was a whole lot more to the story than they were telling the American public. And so you can't be mad at the public for continuing to think that there's something to this, because they've never really been straight with us from the beginning.
Absolutely. It's like when we were in high school and you answer a question in algebra and then your teacher says, "Show me your work." How'd you get that answer? In the same way, what Gary Nolan's pointed out is this double standard where skeptics say to ufologists, or what they would call, quote-unquote, UFO enthusiasts, show us how you got to that conclusion that this is an alien or whatever. But what Gary's pointing out is that the DoD, through AARO, is basically able to say, these are our conclusions, but not demonstrate the same kind of work of how they got there. What was their process? How did they determine it wasn't A or B before they concluded it was C? So it's a complete double standard. And you brought up the most recent episode of Weaponized, and there was a few things that George Knapp specifically said that I thought were really important. He made the point that as someone who studied misinformation, disinformation for decades, he actually kind of takes his hat off to Sean Kirkpatrick and says, you did a pretty remarkable job in the sense that you have in many quarters effectively slowed this down. You haven't shut it down, but you have slowed it down. And we'll get to it in a minute, the political set and what's made them seemingly change their tone, maybe more than meets the eye there. But what George said was basically that AARO had a dual purpose as a disinformation campaign. One is to stop this, to try to basically give enough evidence that people who are semi-curious would be satisfied and say, ultimately nothing to see here, just secret programs, misidentifications of prosaic phenomena, those kinds of things. But the secondly, from his point of view, is that it also allowed the DoD to figure out where the leaks were so they could plug them so future kinds of leaks like this wouldn't happen. So by calling in, inviting in whistleblowers, saying, come, please talk to us. We want to hear about these secret programs. And then you go in and you make these whistleblowers believe that their testimony is being taken seriously. They were often told, we will send you a copy of what was recorded here. They never did get a copy of that, apparently. And then on top of that, the information they gave, it's like going to the wolf to give the information after people are going missing in the forest. And now AARO can go back to the gatekeepers and say, these are where the leaks were coming from. You want to take care of that. Again, there's questions that people pose in terms of how much does Kirkpatrick know? George Knapp seems pretty clear that he is acting as a wise and seasoned disinformation agent. You could certainly make that argument. It's becoming increasingly difficult to not make that argument, just in light of the fact that, again, the report was so poorly done, and it's very difficult to look at it and say this is just people who had too much of an assumption going in. It looks like it's a deliberate attempt to distract and to dismiss. So we'll see where this goes. But again, after that, we get into the question of how are the politicians on the Hill and whatnot interpreting the AARO report, which is a different matter altogether.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. And a huge shout out here to the team at Askapol and Matt Laszlo for their kind of dogged pursuit of sound bites and nuggets from folks in Congress. And through their reporting, we've learned that Senator Kirsten Gillibrand is still keen on kind of getting a further hearing on this subject. And there have been talks about a hearing perhaps in the summertime. We shall see. One big hearing a year seems to me a little bit of a slow process, but perhaps we'll see more activity than we've been seeing, which is always good. And then there's just this strange, I think, head-scratching moment that many of us in the community are having seen the almost like shift in tone from Gillibrand being a champion for this subject and really seeming to be wanting to be fully transparent with what's going on and really kind of read up on the subject, to then recent comments kind of leaving us wondering, has she sort of forgotten about this? Is she actually even paying attention? She didn't even know, for example, that the UAPDA had been gutted the way that it had been, even though that's something that was really championed by her colleague, Senator Chuck Schumer. So all of these things leave the observer just kind of scratching their heads, going, what's really going on here? Are they paying attention? Is this something they're doing purely for political points? I hate to, what I get frustrated with, Darren, to be honest, is I hate the tendency that the people in the community have to jump immediately to conspiracy, because I find that is it's just dangerous ground, right? I totally understand the reasons why we're doing that, why many people are tempted to do that. But at the same time, I find that it, where does it stop? So I have that devil on the shoulder, angel on the other, which one is really happening here? And maybe it's a mixture of both, but it certainly does seem like with her in particular, there has been a clear shift and something unknown has caused her to back off from the kind of dogged pursuit that she had earlier on. And I think everybody remembers clearly that gazebo speech that she gave, where she was almost deriding people that were talking about these being aliens or UFOs or, all the really kind of snarky tone about it. And was quite surprising, given she had been at another conference where some a UFO enthusiast had approached her directly, and she was so exuberant and effusive about supporting this. So it's all very strange. And what is your take on what's going on with Congress? Do you think that we really have folks there with their heart and heads in the game, or do you think that it's a little bit muddier than it appears?
Well, I think it's a mix of a few things, because you'll get some Congress people who will perhaps forget that the fact that the people who are briefing them are ultimately DoD representatives of some form or another. And so when they are saying, here's the briefing and nothing to see here, a lot of this is deeply black U.S. programs, U.S. tech, then these Congress people come away going, I'm actually more skeptical that this is non-human intelligence after all. I think it's likely just our own black tech, really advanced technology. But of course, that's exactly what the DoD wants you to come away with. And some of these Congress people seem to be forgetting that connection. Again, the wolf talking about what the wolves have been doing. And then you have other people like Gillibrand who, like you said, seemed pretty gung-ho at first, were very pro-disclosure. People I know even in Europe were asking me, what's her contact information? We want to connect her with politicians in Europe so we can have this international effort to try to uncover what's going on here. But then suddenly people couldn't get a hold of her, calls were not returned, that kind of thing. And like you say, a couple of these guys are doing a really good job of chasing these people down on the Hill and asking them these questions pointedly. And her responses are quite perplexing in light of her previous enthusiasm, where she says things like, yeah, well, we know that Chuck Schumer got most of what he wanted. And we're like, he did? I don't think so. He's publicly stated in front of cameras and whatnot, in front of the rest of Congress, that he has not, and they're going to try again in those kind of things. And then she went on to say that most Congress people are satisfied with the AARO report. And again, we ask ourselves, they are? How can they be? Are they not paying any attention to the way this is being eviscerated by anybody who has any kind of history in this topic, including mainstream journalists like Merrick? So it is very perplexing. And of course, as you point out, I think we should be cautious not to jump on the conspiracy train immediately. But when you see this degree of a shift, in light of how poorly written the AARO report was, you have to ask yourself questions. We've also recently seen reports of, for instance, whistleblowers involved with the Boeing fiasco, suddenly turning up dead in fairly quick circumstances, somewhat mysterious circumstances. We ask ourselves what kind of technology of a lethal kind of sort could have been developed over decades and decades and decades. These people who are on the Hill have families, they have people they care about. Is it possible people like this have been gotten to, have been scared into backing off? I'm not going to say I know that, but it certainly raises questions in light of what's happened in some other fiascos involving whistleblowers, and in light of how the tone has shifted so prominently and so quickly for some of these Congress people.
Yeah, the Boeing thing is absolutely perplexing, and these two individuals who were whistleblowers on really Boeing safety measures, the safety of the Boeing products, both of them represented by the same law firm, and one committed suicide, the other one died of a bacterial infection of some kind that went awry, and that individual was in his 40s. Certainly very strange, and some people have pointed out that, well, if Boeing had a hit squad to go after these people, they didn't get them at the right time necessarily, because in many cases they'd already given their testimony. But, and again, I want to put on my conspiratorial hat here. If we're talking about Boeing and we're talking about whistleblowers, and it may be more of a message to whistleblowers in general. It might not. Maybe they don't really care too much about, we had some lapses in our safety protocol. Maybe they care more about whistleblowers just generally. And this is it's like the mob essentially saying, don't mess with us because this is what will happen to you. If you decide to do this, this is what we're going to do to you. And no one's going to do anything to us. We're basically untouchable because we can kind of get you wherever we need to get you, no matter how old you are or healthy you are, doesn't matter. We can make it look like it's totally prosaic and an accident. So, who knows? This sort of thinking has been a part of the American kind of lore for a very, very long time. Has it happened? Absolutely. Absolutely. I recently finished watching The Octopus Murders on Netflix, and it gets into some of this content as well. Powerful companies and powerful people, really making people disappear, making problems go away. So it's definitely not outside the realm of possibility. And I think the American people looking at situations like this are just continuing to ask ourselves, like, is no one accountable? Is there anything that we can rely on here, anything trustworthy? Because the faith in our institutions could not be at a lower point. And when these things continue to happen, it just only reinforces that frustration. So it makes it for a very difficult environment for disclosure to even occur. Because how can you have a trustworthy process when there's this intense cloud of obfuscation, secrecy, lies, dark things that have happened in our history that kind of go into this entire package? It's quite frustrating.
Indeed, and I think it's worth noting that even for me in some of the inner circles I'm involved in, I've been warned on occasion about what to say publicly and certain precautions we should take to make it more likely that nothing nefarious would end up happening to us. It does make you think, and to the point you made earlier, one of the arguments is the reason why David Grush experienced so much pushback, including the attempted character assassination, bringing up his autism, bringing up his mental breakdown when one of his colleagues and friends died. That really was, like you said, a warning for the next row of whistleblowers. If you come forward, this will happen to you. This is what happens, and we will get into later on when we sort of go through this least to most shocking elements of the phenomenon that are coming out. If some of the more really out there notions are true, and I think there's a good reason to believe they are, then you can understand that some of these groups have no choice in some ways but to come out really swinging to try to keep this under wraps, because if it does come out, it's game over. It's going to be a massive national reckoning. So I'm not surprised that these kind of tactics are used. They've been used historically. Now, because there's more of a spotlight, because of social media and things, if one of these people were to suddenly disappear, it looks awfully strange and suspicious. But these whistleblowers that whistleblowed on Boeing ended up dead. And like you point out, on the one hand, it seems to shine a light and say, this looks highly suspicious. But again, if the goal is not so much to stop what they've done, but to put a stopgap in so that no more whistleblowers come forward, that's a pretty effective way to do it. And again, the lethality options on the table for some of these groups where it's not necessarily something you can trace back. I think back to moments, for instance, in the lore, the historical lore that goes into like the remote viewing program and those kinds of things. There was a point where Pat Price was in Las Vegas, I think, or somewhere around there, and died, and it was suspicious, and there were already people that were really concerned about what he was doing in the intelligence community. But then on top of that, you had his body cremated within 12 hours of the death, and it had never been asked for by his spouse. They made it sound like it was just some sort of mistake, but of course, if there is some sort of agent of lethality used, it's completely untraceable once you've cremated the body. So these situations that turn up, and to this point with one of these whistleblowers that you pointed to, often involving suicide, which is also part of what's demonstrated in the octopus murders, which I would recommend people watch if they want to see how these things sometimes walk out. Yeah, it raises a lot of questions, and we will see probably more of this, or at least more threats towards these ends before we get to something like official disclosure.
Yeah, it's quite scary, to be honest, and it speaks to, as you pointed out, the real complexity here at work and the breadth, scope, and impact of the truth. So we're going to get into some of that as we go through some of these subjects, and I think we'll just go ahead and get started with that. We had a couple other current events, but I think we can just jump into these since we want to really spend some good time on them. So what we want to do here is walk through basically kind of a spectrum of types of disclosure from, easy to digest, easy to accept, commonly accepted, to really out there kinds of aspects of what disclosure might entail that people might have a difficult time coming to terms with, as there's a lot on the table. And if you've been studying this for any amount of time, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It can feel overwhelming, like you're drowning in all of these different ideas, and it can be difficult to parse what might seem to be realistic about what it actually is versus some sort of fantasy. And I think it's important to walk through all these different sort of topics and ideas to discuss our own comfort level with them and why we find those things to be more plausible than not plausible, and then I kind of reflect too, I think, macroscopically, how would the public approach topics like this? And so I think the easiest place to start here is really on a subject that I think most mainstream individuals would agree at this point. including the mainstream scientific community, and that is alien life exists somewhere out in the universe. This is pretty commonly accepted. Have we found evidence of that yet? No, but we are hard at work trying to find it. We've heard recently that there's possible signs of life on this planet K2-18b that's 125 light years away, but that's not even like ruffling any feathers. People are sort of like, well, of course, it's just a matter of time. That's the phrase you hear often. It's a matter of time before we just make that discovery of a biosignature on another planet outside of our solar system. It's going to happen, maybe even in our solar system. We're sending, probes to Enceladus and Titan, these kinds of places, to find these same signs of life. So it's a pretty commonly accepted notion, easy to digest. Now, going from there, they are here. This is where it gets a little bit more difficult, but I think where many people who've been studying this or interested in it or fans of science fiction, this isn't that difficult to come to terms with. Yes, there's life, and yes, they've been visiting us. They're on the planet. And Darren, as you kind of get on the on-ramp here of the topic, this is where a lot of people, they start here. They don't start in the deep end. They start here. And it seems like it's, okay, this seems fairly plausible. We've had some sightings in the past. Roswell, great example. So, yeah, okay, there's life, and they've been visiting us. I can deal with that. And I know you've been through that kind of similar journey yourself, but how long do you think people stay in that sort of place before they then start jumping into the other layers of possibility?
Right. Well, the first thing to point out, even in one more layer of granularity, is there's the notion of alien life existing, but as we are reminded frequently by our scientists and whatnot, that's most likely going to be microbial life. It's going to be a very early version of life. That's what is expected to be found. And to the point you raised in our last episode where we talked about different degrees of disclosure, what's interesting there is that might be a moment to sort of take us into the more complicated notions. So if you concede in the collective consciousness, sure enough, life exists elsewhere. We've found it already. Therefore, that begins to prep the mind for there probably will be life all over the place. We're just going to suddenly find many, many occasions of it in the same way that it wasn't all that long ago in our lifetimes that very, very few planets have been identified. Now, every year, there's more and more of these exoplanets being identified because our means of finding these has increased so much. But yeah, absolutely. It's one thing to say alien life exists out there somewhere. But once you talk about alien life being here, Nathan, it sounds like you're talking about little green men. And that makes me pretty uncomfortable. It sounds like we're in X-Files territory. Is this an H.G. Wells play or something? Yeah, so this is where even today, in 2024, news hosts, journalists, politicians can't help but snicker and scoff a little bit, have to tell a joke on the side to bring this up in polite society. It's really, really bizarre. A lot of it has to do with, I think, the fact that we wouldn't want to believe that we live in a world where we are primitive enough that we wouldn't know that they were here. Because if they're here, and we've been going about our business as if we're the apex species and no other sophisticated life is here, then clearly we're wrong, which not only corrects that notion, but it really puts us in our place because we're then to have been here. And we'll get into in a moment how this might be stretched even further to they've been here all along. Were they involved with our seeding, our evolution, those kinds of things? But once you even grapple with the fact that they've been here, they are here, but not in any of the ways that we would predict in terms of leaving some sort of signature that would be obvious for us to pick up, that makes us nervous because it knocks us down a few levels. So I think that's partly what's going on here, is both an individual and a collective uncomfortability psychologically with that notion.
Yeah, it's sort of like if you've ever been at the grocery store, and this has never happened to me, of course, but you go to the grocery store and you forget to pick up a cart or you forget to pick up a basket, and you're like, I'm going to go in for just a couple of items. I'm going to carry the items through the store and I'll be just fine. And as you start adding more items to your arms, you realize you've made a mistake and you can no longer hold everything. And then all of a sudden you've got to find new buckets, new things to put those items in, and you got to go get the cart, get the basket, or you just sort of fumble along, shuffling through the store, trying to make yourself not look like an idiot. And that's sort of what we're talking about here in some ways. It's sort of, you start out by saying, I can handle this idea, and I can handle this idea, but then you realize that once you start accepting these notions, it opens up an entire new possibility space that you have to then take very seriously, have to consider. It's sort of also what I see from like Elon Musk. Well, they possibly couldn't. I would know. I've got 6,000 Starlink satellites, and I see. If anybody would know, I would know, and I would tell people about it. So the fact that it's happening under our noses, even for people like Elon Musk, it's a tremendous paradigm shift. So we're using the notion here of a spectrum of notions that are easiest to accept to hardest. But the truth is that one very much leads into the other, which opens up these vast possibility spaces that we then have to wrestle with, and they're very difficult. They're bringing open so many different concepts in and of themselves that you're almost rapidly falling into the other ones. So alien lot life exists. We've kind of gotten that far. They're also here. But then another kind of revelation that might be a part of this story is not only is alien life here, but there might be more than one kind, right? So this is this idea that there might be different species of extraterrestrials. Then there might be other even aspects of non-human intelligence. That's the sort of phrase that's used now to allude to interdimensional or extraterrestrial or ethereal. There are all these sort of different words that might be used to describe the different kinds of non-human intelligence that are interacting on this planet. Crypto-terrestrial, ultra-terrestrial, all these things I think our audience are quite familiar with. So that then brings in this cornucopia of different agendas to have to wrestle with there. What do you think about when you start trying to get your arms around that concept? Where does it really stop? I mean, how many? Is it just endless numbers of species and kind of beings that are here? And where do we say, okay, I think that's probably enough. We've got our arms around what might be happening.
Well, it's interesting because one of the aspects that comes in here, one of the variables that inevitably plays into this, is people bring all sorts of assumptions to the table, not just about the way the world is, but what they assume uncharted parts of the universe would be like as well. And these are largely just assumptions, that they're not based in fact. So there are certain things about the phenomenon that seem to, again, stretch credibility in such a way that people dismiss it because of that. So you brought up, for instance, that Elon Musk and people like that say, listen, we've got sensors, cameras, really high definition tools everywhere now, right? In space, in our atmosphere. And if these things were going on, we would know about it, right? Elon Musk makes the point, if anyone in the world would know about it, it's me. On the flip side of that, though, you've got people saying, what do you mean the UFO showed up with these like bright green, red, and white lights? Why would a UFO need lights? They don't have to adhere to FAA regulations, right? So you get people saying, sort of making arguments on both sides of that equation. On the one hand, there's no way they could be here and us not see them regularly or be able to pick them up. And on the other hand, when we do see them or catalog them, they seem to be going, hey, see us with flashing lights like it's 4th of July sometimes. And that, again, to some people just seems preposterous on the face of it. Even people like Kirkpatrick, I think, have used this as a tactic. He said, for instance, in that Scientific American interview, that the notion that these things would be flying across the vast expanse of outer space only to crash in the desert here because they can't navigate our atmosphere is irrational, right? And he uses this as a tactic to basically make ufologists and anyone in our community look like we just really struggle with basic critical thinking skills, right? So this is where the phenomenon kind of makes itself known and then refutes its own existence in some ways by the ways it shows up. You could argue that's just because they don't think like we do, so they wouldn't necessarily follow our axiomatic logic. Or you could argue that that's part of the control system that even Vallée has talked about, that they do these things where they show up and they're able to cause a change in human consciousness, but then back that up with another kind of behavior that makes us think that couldn't have really happened. So they've made the change in our collective consciousness, but taken away the mechanism by which that happened, which is a pretty interesting bait and switch if you think about it. But to this point about the different species that you brought up, here's another one. Why do they look so humanoid? That's preposterous, right? We know that alien life would probably look completely bizarre, probably might be so strange that we might not even be able to recognize it. What's to say they'd even be carbon-based, right? Let alone the fact that they have 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, 2 eyes, a mouth, a nose, some semblance of ears. and that they can communicate with us. We have a hard time communicating with people across the ocean, right, that happen to speak a different language with our own species. And yet we can hear from them. What? They communicate telepathically? What is that? This is ridiculous, right? So it's sort of one thing builds on top of another, and you get into further and further into crazy land for some sort of physicalist perspectives, because one seemingly outlandish notion is built on another and another. But when it comes to the different species, that's one of the most perplexing ones. And I think the work of people like Mike Masters has helped us there, at least, in suggesting at least some of what might be going on is that some of these beings are some version of us from the future, which would explain the link, right? You go from a chimpanzee to a modern Homo sapiens sapien to a gray alien, and you could argue that those are different points along one evolutionary trajectory. But without that, thinking that some of these beings are, whether interdimensional or extraterrestrial, again, why would they look like that in light of the fact that they would have arisen in completely different environmental conditions? None of that makes sense. So again, the very way this ends up demonstrating itself in our midst also tends to negate the possibility in many, many people's minds. So this is part of what makes this such a difficult thing to grapple with. We see increasing evidence in the margins, and for those of us who are really willing to look, it looks like there's a there. But to those who are going by assumptions, going by conventional thinking, it stretches credibility so many times over and over again that they can't possibly believe it's true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and here, something that just came to mind to me is, this is almost what you would see if a species has gained mastery over its perceptual domain, like I would argue human beings have. We've gained a great degree of mastery over our own perceptual domain, but then kind of forgetting that domain is actually a fairly narrow band of reality itself. Then, just as you said, we would begin bumping into the margins of that band. Like, in fact, we would be brushing up against those margins often, because the degree to which we kind of traverse that band of awareness now with our sensors and our technology, like, we're going to be hitting those margins of those barriers of our band of awareness very, very often. And so it does, in a sense, kind of reveal to us that, yeah, there is more outside those margins, but we're ill-equipped to understand it. And so it ends up kind of portraying itself in these rather insane and absurd ways that we also, as you point out, can't replicate, can't measure within the band that we have such great control over. So we've kind of confused this amazing ability to control and master for the fact that we think we should be able to master the entire spectrum when we really can't. One aspect of this too, which you want to jump back in on that before I go to the next point.
Yeah, just one quick point, and that is, again, this is an example where the humanoid shape also tends to violate our assumptions about how origins come about, how evolution happens, right? So many of our modern assumptions are based in physicalism and in Darwinism. So the notion there is that life is kind of a fluke. It happens when the certain elements come together in just such a way, and then they develop based on the constraints of their environment until you end up with something like what looks like a humanoid, right? Whether it's something like a chimpanzee or a great ape or a human being. But again, that assumes a lot. It assumes truths about things that we weren't around to check whether or not that was the case, right? So if it's the case that there was this ancient seeding program across planets by a much older civilization, which when you think about it is completely plausible, this could explain what's going on. Perhaps we should get ready for humanities, plural, right, rather than a singular. What does that mean? One of the most perplexing, and some people would say preposterous, notions of the UFO phenomenon is, in addition to gray aliens and reptilians and tall whites, these beings that look very humanoid, we even have Nordics that look like a very specific kind of northern race of humans. And sometimes we have humans that look so much like us that they could walk amongst us. That's one of the things that's claimed too, that they do. And they look exactly like us. How is that possible? What does it mean that there are humans that are themselves extraterrestrials? These, again, are notions that fly in the face of our common assumptions. And this is the challenge, because we have to not just take this where it comes now and add it to what we know, but we have to completely undo so many of our assumptions in conventional thinking, Darwinianism, physicalism, these kind of notions. And that's what I think makes it so difficult for the general population to grok and to really metabolize.
Yeah, we're kind of being asked to to accept things that are outside of our paradigm that defines what we can accept. So it's very, very challenging. And I think for anyone who is interested in this subject but considers themselves more so of a skeptic of it, I completely understand that perspective, because it does tend to snowball in a way, and it kind of feels like you're losing your ability to rationally connect the dots. And that's because our very framework for understanding what is rational and normal is essentially being challenged wholesale. And then we're left with, sort of like the guy who showed up to try to fix something without a toolbox. Like, I don't have anything that I can do to solve this, so I'm just going to have to walk away. I can't do anything here. So it's very, very difficult. And, some of these other confounding subjects that go along with this sort of spectrum, you hinted at some of these, but, we talked about things like crashes. How could they possibly crash? And if they have crashed, then we clearly might have retrieved those crashes. And if we've retrieved those crashes and realized that they weren't ours and they weren't our adversaries, then maybe we should be studying these. Maybe we should be, creating secret programs to try to reverse engineer this technology that looks nothing like what we've ever created. And maybe we crack some of that here and there. Maybe we, spit out some solutions that end up appearing in our society as technological breakthroughs that came via some of these other retrieval programs. So we don't know, but you can see how that's certainly plausible in the chain of events here. And then we've had what we've heard from David Grush that I think hasn't gotten quite the attention that maybe it should, partly because it is so discombobulating and scary to sort of to go there. And that's this notion of agreements with these beings, some kind of agreement between a U.S. government or a government and one of the species. In exchange for their technology, they get to do X, Y, Z. That idea opens up, again, a whole other host of possibilities. So to me, like, this is the definite shift from, okay, I can be very nuts and bolts here, and there's craft, and there's bodies, and there's crashes, and we're studying this stuff. But then when we get into agreements and we start getting into technological exchange, we're really getting close and starting to creep into the wilder, weirder woo things that we begin hearing about within the community. So what do you think about that, the agreements aspect of it, and what kind of flows out of agreements in your mind? What are some of the natural downstream consequences that we would need to consider if that happens to be true?
Well, first of all, I'm confident it is true. I think what's interesting is when you think back to David Grush's testimony, even all the Congress people were kind of at the edge of their seats when he started talking about quote-unquote biologics. And then he's asked, were these human biologics or non-human? Non-human, he clarifies. Again, a remarkable moment in our history, testifying before Congress and saying that not only have strange craft been found, which you could argue, some skeptics will argue, could have just been Russian or Chinese craft or something, but when you confirm that biological material was recovered that was clearly demonstrating these were non-human, again, we think about Chuck Schumer and the Schumer Amendment and how often that term suddenly appears when it didn't used to appear in official government documentation. That seems to just suggest strongly that they have biological evidence, genetic evidence, telling them this is not human as we traditionally understand. So that's interesting to me, that you notice what's happening in this disclosure push, that we begin with craft, the idea of seeing UFOs up in the sky. And then it's a big stretch to believe that these things could have crashed and that we've recovered them. Remember, even when I talked to Bernardo Castro, he seemed still a little bit shocked that we supposedly had these stockpiled somewhere, right? And when you think about what Jason Sands has said, he said that these are found fairly regularly, to the point where over the decades we might have 30 or more of these craft by now. He also actually said that he finds most of Bob Lazar's testimony credible in light of what he's seen. So that's interesting, because then we go from lights in the sky, which holds open at least a plausible deniability that it could just be birds or weird weather phenomena or something. Once you have craft and hangars that, are nuts and bolts craft that operate in ways that we don't understand. Again, we think about Initial Revelations, that second book that came out from Lukatsky and Kelleher and George Knapp, where they talk about the recovery of a craft that seemed to be aerodynamic, but didn't seem to have any fuel. didn't seem to have any control surfaces, no means of propulsion, right? So this is part of it, that this is not just a notion of somebody happened to see something in the sky that maybe they mistook for something. It wasn't a craft, it was just an SR-71 or something. Preposterous, because what we have here is credible people saying that we have recovered these craft. And again, this has been now testified before Congress. So already you've taken a big, big leap, because you're having to acknowledge at that point there has to be an intelligence for these intelligent craft to be built the way they are. Then you get to the question of what are these beings? Who are they? How sophisticated might they be if they are in our presence and we haven't been able to detect them through our usual means? Then, like you say, you get into this notion of there being different species. And as I've made the point numerous times on this podcast and on Point of Convergence, when we're dealing with the unknown, we like things as simple as possible, because already we feel uncomfortable having to acknowledge and grok and metabolize the unknown. But when there's complexity and wrinkles to that unknown, that gets really overwhelming for us. And we have kind of an evolutionarily derived fight or flight kind of mechanism when that comes in. So when we talk about there being different accords with different kinds of beings, this again puts many, many people in an uncomfortable position. But when I think about this, I can't help but reflect on what Jason Sands has recently testified to. Again, you and I have talked about how in many ways it wasn't ideal that this came out on a Twitter or /X space rather than through congressional testimony or something. But he made the point that he's been through the whole Doppler process. He's been holding back his story for a long, long time, not just because he was getting approval to talk about certain things, but he's been sitting with this for decades, basically. A lot of this happened back in the 90s for him. One of the things he said is that he testified to being in underground bases where he saw non-human intelligence there with humans, with military groups. So not only do we have now David Grush saying that, yes, there have been accords historically, but now we have another whistleblower coming forward and saying he's witnessed seeing some of these non-human beings in the presence of human beings. Interestingly, he added a wrinkle that we have not heard before. Again, this is partly interpretation on his part, maybe some assumption, but he had the sense that they were a little bit uncomfortable with that agreement. They were uncomfortable with that setting because their concern, the NHI, was that human beings tend to weaponize these things. We give you technology, you tend to weaponize it. So that was an interesting addition to the lore that we had not heard before, that even when we think about these accords that I pointed out before, that groups making accords with the military-industrial complex are not likely to be really high on the spectrum of consciousness development. But if it's sort of an awkward situation where these things are kind of thrust upon them because they have had their craft taken in kind of thing, been captured, and they have to make some sort of on-the-fly arrangements, then these kind of things could happen. Again, like we said earlier about history, sometimes it's accidents of history, strange flukes that cause these things to happen. So that raises all sorts of questions about the nature of these accords, how long-running have they been, how tenuous are they, all these things. But yeah, to me, that was interesting. It seems to corroborate things I was already comfortable with and I've heard elsewhere from some of my sources. But I'm really curious to hear from you, being a non-experiencer and having to yourself metabolize these things over the last few years. When it gets into that degree of detail, how do you feel about that? How have you watched your own journey trying to take in and ground those kind of potential realities?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very difficult. In total honesty, it's very difficult because it does bring so many possibilities to the table that I think are incredibly challenging to assent to. I think I hear of things like abductions that have happened, secret agendas that are at work here. If there are agreements and I don't know about them and they're not public, then what's in the agreement? What's in the paperwork? What are we allowed to do? What are they allowed to do? What kind of exchange is actually happening? So all of this is it's daunting because the possibility space becomes so broad. If we're talking about reality-changing technologies, anything and everything becomes on the table there. So I think, as someone who's looking at this from the outside, who hasn't had a direct experience, who hasn't been friends, necessarily with someone that's had a really close experience, you're kind of left having to weigh these things on a scale of credibility, right? And I think where I tend to lean is on the fact that there are so many accounts that you can't. It'd be weird if there were just maybe a couple, people with interesting stories and maybe they ended up writing a sci-fi novel or something, but you've got account after account after account from various individuals, all walks of life, who don't know each other, and they're telling similar kinds of stories. So there's either this strange kind of subversive, psychosis there that's at work, or there's something to this. And so I think I lean in toward there is something to this. What exactly it is, the specific details of what it is, that's where I still struggle, because, I tend to, like a lot of people, show me exactly what proof we have that this has happened, because people are oftentimes unreliable narrators. I can believe that they've had an experience, but exactly what they say they think happened may not be in fact true. They interpret it as a certain thing. So you really have to kind of parse that interpretation, and again, hopefully look for similar interpretation, because the more similar interpretation you run across, then that increases the probability, the likelihood that in fact is true. So that's generally how I approach this, that I don't look at it entirely from a skeptical perspective as if there's nothing there. I think there is something there. As far as like how down that rabbit hole things actually go, I think we'll get into some of those areas fairly soon, but, where I struggle with things specifically are areas like, secret space program and, space-time reality engineering and, the Adjustment Bureau type stuff. I mean, these are concepts that I can 100% grant are on the table, because if the technologies and if reality manipulation is advanced in the way that it is, or if reality is anything like what we understand it to be, then everything can kind of be on the table. So I get that. But where I struggle with is, where does it really end? Because so many things can be true in that kind of environment, that possibility space. Where does it actually stop?
Absolutely. And you raised some really interesting notions there we'll have to get to, and we'll be probably stretching even the believability ratio for some of the audience, and include elements that I've been researching, even though I haven't addressed them too much in podcasts yet, because I like to have a pretty strong sense of what's going on before I report on it. But I was wanting to discuss again this notion of the accords, the agreements, and bring up one element that we haven't talked much about yet, but we probably can jump into now because it's connected, is around abductions and the hybridization program, those kind of things, because there have been rumors, some would even argue evidence, suggesting that the accords have had to do with those notions as well. So what's interesting is Jason Sands, again, lent some credibility towards the claims that have been made by Dan Sherman. So Dan Sherman speaks about being in the military, being involved in these gray programs that are above black in terms of how top secret they were, that involved basically elements of the Air Force. Again, a very small number of people were read into these programs, but that were aware that abductions were happening, had even signed off on them as part of this arrangement that technology would be provided as the other side. That was the carrot that was being offered, basically, to look the other way while these abductions took place. And again, according to Sherman's account, and those who are interested, I did a POC episode on his claims. But basically, his sense was that he had been, again, this gets pretty out there in terms of the claims, right? He claims that while he was still in the womb of his mother, who herself was an abductee, he was genetically altered, augmented by NHI, so that one day he would grow up, take a role within the Air Force, and become instrumental as being able to receive telepathic communication from the Greys that he would relay to his superiors around information that included where and when an abduction was going to take place. So coordinates with which he eventually began to recognize seemed like latitude and longitude, and things like timing, those kinds of things, dates. So what I want to bring into here as a notion is that, again, sometimes because of accidents of history and because of the way that history is never clean, it's never what you would like it to be, you sometimes have to deal with elements that you probably would not want to deal with, even people groups you do not want to deal with, because circumstances demand it. And for the greater good, you have to sometimes accept accords, agreements with groups that you might not otherwise want to do business with. Now, I want to flip it around here, flip the script and say, what if you're NHI, realizing that you are doing something for the greater good, assuming for a second that at least a large portion of the abductions are for a good purpose, ultimately, including our future and their future. But you think it would be catastrophic for the general populace of humans to know about these things, because we tend to fall into fight or flight when these things are going on. And so you feel like you're forced to make some sort of agreement with the military to allow for this to carry on, because that is the best possible scenario. It's the least evil on the table, basically. We do this already. We have to make agreements with warlords in some developing countries. We have to sometimes deal with terrorists, even though sometimes our politicians say we do not compromise, we do not negotiate with terrorists. But sometimes you have to save lives of your citizens and whatnot, or people that have been held hostage. So I want to introduce the equation here that potentially NHI have had to make these tenuous agreements, not because it's their first choice, but it's the best choice on the table in light of the fact that full disclosure from their perspective would be much more catastrophic.
Yeah, I mean, I like thinking from that perspective, because it does challenge our notions of why things would happen, what actually is possible. But it is frustrating. It's sort of it's what we know in the modern world. We're all very cognizant of the fact that our governments have like an official propagandized narrative of their state, goals, their mission, what they stand for. And then we all are aware of the like you pointed out, the dark, nefarious things that they do, the dark underbelly of these institutions that do things that aren't in alignment with those stated principles and goals. And we, the citizens, are left sort of kind of, are we culpable in this? Do we have some responsibility to this? Like, how do we, there might be some really unsavory things that our government is doing that I'm funding. And how do I feel about that? Well, I don't feel great. I don't want to be part of that. And so we have this, moral conflict with it, which I think we should. It's a complex thing. These systems are highly complicated. And when you throw into the mix here this notion of these, agreements and other agendas and really entire, eras of our past being completely rewritten, like not just talking here about a 20th century that's nothing like we thought it was, but in our human history is nothing like what we thought it was. These notions really can kind of unravel quite quickly. I think of this concept here of like in the Marvel universe, you have these sort of canonical events. Like, in this situation, Spider-Man was supposed to do this, and if he doesn't do this, and the whole sort of story, that the timeline kind of falls apart and the reality changes. I mean, that's essentially kind of what we're dealing with here is learning that there are events in our history that are totally unlike what we were told, and then if that's true, then we're left holding those pieces and having to put it all back together and understand who we are in light of that new truth. Because we've oriented ourselves around these concepts. Our entire society, our global societies, have oriented ourselves around these mutually accepted sort of understandings of history and reality, et cetera. And if you're telling me that those things that we've all agreed to are real aren't really what they appear to be, well, then we've got a really messy, ugly picture that emerges. And folks, like, disclosure, in my opinion, is wrapped up in all of that. We've got a lot to do. It's like kind of trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. A very difficult task when the truth does come to light.
Absolutely. And we've discussed, I think, at length on this podcast, how the rewriting of history is a major component of this. And that is one of the most destabilizing elements. Like we pointed out already, people can handle the fact that aliens exist. They can probably even get their head around the fact that they've been here on occasion. When you start talking about abductions, hybridization campaigns, accords with different governments, and then even the notion that 20th century American history could be quite different than what we've been taught, and that eventually you go back to the very, very beginning. Again, Jason Sands kind of speculatively went into the notion that he looks at religious history in different traditions around the world and sees NHI and our interaction with NHI in those accounts. Now, of course, he's had his own personal account with an NHI. He encountered a being, and this was a being that he perceived as being very benevolent, very friendly. When he spoke to him audibly, it sounded a bit like Norwegian, but he couldn't make heads or tails of it. But then the being spoke in his mind telepathically, and it made complete sense, no problem whatsoever. And in fact, as we've often heard in the lore, again, to your point, this is repeated time and time again, which adds credibility. There was kind of a sharing of their entire persona, their entire history, the essence of their being, you could argue, was picked up. And he had nothing but positive things to say about this being. But also at the same time, this being was able to seemingly put his colleagues who were sitting in a truck or something into a kind of zombie-like state where they probably didn't remember anything. So again, our notions of ourselves are challenged here because we see beings that are able to demonstrate incredible technological prowess, also seem to be further along in terms of their consciousness developments, many of them anyway, but at the same time, obviously view us a little bit like easily triggered monkeys that need to be controlled by either gases that exude from the walls of the craft that I covered in the most recent POC episode, or through direct mental control, psychic control of us. And in light of my experience in the hotel, I know what it feels like to do something that doesn't make any sense based on your normal behavior patterns. And there is no beginning or ending or where I built, like I can say, this is where I lost volition and regained volition. It's just all one seamless thing. That is a discombobulating experience for anyone to go through. And again, it makes us uncomfortable because of what the place it puts us in the midst of all this. So this goes everywhere, ultimately, is the point. As I've said before, this is the one topic that leaves no other topic unscathed. We're getting further and further into the weeds here, and I think it's probably stretching people's believability scale more and more. But what's next up as we march towards more and more difficult things to grok?
Well, you've hinted at some of this, and this won't be too much of a surprise, but I think where we begin to really get into woo territory is about consciousness and the manipulation of consciousness, about the role that consciousness plays in reality itself, moving away from purely a technological manipulation of our consciousness, but flipping the script entirely and saying that consciousness may in fact be the bedrock of reality. And if that is true, then what else is true that flows from that assertion? A lot of things begin to change, and we have, as we've discussed many times on this show, a lot of hints in our science and in our experience that point in this direction. You know, we've talked about things like telepathy and remote viewing and psi ability, past lives. I saw you share an article that was, I think, from the Washington Post or the Seattle, I can't remember which one, but I retweeted that, about the people that have past lives. A great piece there. We have a lot of evidence that something is going on, and I found that piece interesting too, because you had these perspectives of really, professional parents who had careers in, psychology or whatever, trying to come to grips with what was happening here and agreeing that something weird was going on, but then finding it difficult to go further than that. What really more than that is at work here? So it's quite interesting to me that a lot of roads end up going toward consciousness, and if consciousness is on the table in the way that we're talking about, everything else is on the table. Every kind of strange aberration, mutation of reality that we can come up with begins to enter into the picture, because consciousness is reality may be more like a dreamscape rather than this kind of materialist building block influencing other building block kind of situation.
Absolutely. And again, you have to ask yourself the question, how much can people take on in one fell swoop? I've often pointed out that it's taken us years to get here. And it's interesting, on the most recent Weaponized podcast episode again, George Knapp was talking about how these comedy shows have put together pieces about the UFO phenomenon. And what's interesting is apparently like even a year was spent in gathering information, background on this topic so they could do it justice, basically. But George said very interestingly, that's not nearly enough time to understand what's going on here, because you get to the surface level and that's hard enough. But then when you get deeper and deeper, it gets more and more strange and stretches laterally further and further and further. So we've already talked about 20th century American history being significantly different than we've been taught. We talked about this impacting and perhaps even authoring our religious histories. We've talked about the possibility that even the origin of our human species could be part of a seeding program that happened from a much more ancient civilization. Now we're going to talk about the fabric of reality itself, right, with consciousness. Where does it stop? It does not stop. That's the point. This goes everywhere. It eventually unravels everything. There's very little left on the table when you're done. When you think about a family sitting around the table with a tablecloth and plates and knives and forks and whatnot and glasses, some fruit punch in the middle, By the time you pull out the tablecloth, everything goes everywhere. That's kind of where we end up at. But what's interesting is that when I had my conversation with Bernardo Kastrup, he wasn't even reflecting on the UFO phenomenon. He said that when you look at human history itself, human origins, we look anomalous. We just are so unlike any other species on the planet. And he said that while the idea that we were seeded by some other civilization seems outlandish, it's the least outlandish theory on the table, basically, is what he said. Furthermore, he pointed out that, and this is someone who worked at CERN, someone who's built computers his entire life, who has a PhD in computer science as well as in philosophy. He pointed out that technology that's external, that's working with material and stuff, is a much more primitive, downstream kind of technology. The most essential technology, the most advanced technology, would be working with the structure of reality itself, which is based, again, in consciousness. So you're talking about being able to author at that level. And what's interesting with this phenomenon is we see that happening. And I before talked about, for instance, this notion of the pre-trans fallacy that comes from integral theory, where people will notice a certain kind of claimed behavior and they will mistake it for something being like a lower level of consciousness. So when people talk about these beings came through the wall, levitated me out into the craft, people will say, that's magical thinking. That's the kind of thing that shamanic traditions used to say 1,000 years ago. These people just don't understand science. But of course, if you can get to the point where you understand the substructure of physical reality, of material, that being just one modulation of consciousness, and consciousness being the ultimate bedrock, then you can work at the level that prefaces what becomes material objects. And his point is that that's where the future lies. And again, he's not talking about what he's seen with the UFO phenomenon. He's saying his understanding as an idealist about the fabric of reality suggests that that's where technology will go ultimately, is towards consciousness manipulation itself. And the reason why that's so interesting in relation to this topic is that we see that everywhere, both in their psychic control and their telepathic communication, the way that even their craft seem to be semi-biological, and that this notion of is it technology or is it life seems to get really blurry. These are all things that they seem to be demonstrating to us, which is exactly the kind of future that someone like Bernardo Kastrup is predicting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're going to get weird. We're going to get real weird. And that, to me, is kind of exciting because it does signal this profound shift in our way of relating with reality. And as we talked about before, in our own journeys with the idealist perspective, that the meaning that gets introduced into your life by taking that perspective as opposed to the traditional sort of materialist viewpoint. I find it interesting as well that we're seeing sort of hints of these ideas starting to get seeded into our collective awareness through our own popular media. The recent hit on Netflix, The Three-Body Problem. Many people have read those books. One of the kind of concepts that show wrestles with is that these entities from this other star system, and it has these very materialist foundations, but what they can do is sort of manipulate our perception. They can manipulate what we think is happening in reality. In fact, one of the key episodes of the show is kind of deals with the extent of their ability to manipulate the perceived reality around individuals. And then it gets to this point of the conclusion being maybe you're going to experience nothing but madness and confusion, and what is it like to live in a world where you can't rationally, if you go from a highly rational perspective and you can no longer rely on that rationality to then make predictions and build technological innovation, because nothing flows rationally from one causal thing to the other, where does that leave you as an individual that has sort of leaned on that paradigm your entire life? It's insanity. It's essentially the outcome. What can you trust? What is real? And so I think we're starting to get those ideas now seeded into the collective collective mind about what power, what influence alien non-human intelligence may in fact have over our very notions of who we are, what is possible, what our history is, what is reality like itself, what is the universe like. All of these concepts come into play, and I think it's not just like an incremental change. It's not just like us discovering like, hey, we found a new particle, and with this new particle, I can create this cool new material, and I can then create this fancier iPhone. Like it's entirely different than that. It's so dramatically different than that. It'd be launching our entire civilization into a completely different age, a paradigm shift, a completely different age of thinking, of being, of understanding. Huge implications there, and that's, to me, Darren, that's where I feel like we are. We're on the cusp of that in more ways than one, but specifically for non-human intelligence, I feel like that is what is at stake now.
Absolutely. And I want to leave some time at the end here to get into the most fringe ideas when it comes to the phenomenon. But let me touch on some things you said there. Yes, with the three-body problem, what's interesting there is you have this notion that an alien race that's really advanced could basically start messing with your perception of the constants of nature. So like you say, we develop a notion of how the universe works based on certain constants, which we, again, as the word implies, that there are things that we can rely on in order to make predictions about nature. When suddenly they sort of step between us and those constants and are able to manipulate our perception of them, we suddenly have this kind of breakdown that happens where our scientific elite start committing suicide in that book and also in the show that was made, because, again, it undoes their entire history of how they think the world works, how they think reality works. So that would be an interesting psyop in itself, right? It's not just that you mess with people, but you mess with them to such a degree that they assume that cannot be manipulation. That must be something about reality that we have misunderstood up until now, and that creates desperation. So that's an interesting psychological kind of operation. But what's interesting here as well is that what they're getting at there is this notion of the reproducibility problem, right? So if the constants aren't reliable, then we can't trust these experiments to be reproducible, and therefore all of our notions about the scientific method and how we learn about science and progress as a species go out the door. One of the things that Janice and I discussed in Event Horizon is that actually we're seeing this happen in our science, not because some alien race with 3 suns is trying to fool us, but because there's something about the way the world actually works where, again, it's more like a cohering of collective consciousness is what manifests physical reality, to the point where things that used to be reliable, that we used to see reproduced in terms of results time and time and time again by these scientific experiments, suddenly those results are not turning up the same way. And that, again, flies in the face of the way we assume things must be. And this goes back to what we said a few minutes ago in terms of the fabric of reality. If physical reality is an extension, an epiphenomenon of consciousness, then as the players that put together the consciousness sphere that produces physical reality change or evolve, then so too will physical reality, which again, as we discussed in that podcast, raises questions around what is science? What are we actually doing with science? Are we just measuring perception, which can evolve? That's what basically Bernardo would say. It's what Don Hoffman would say. This is where the evidence is leading us. So that to me is fascinating. And to your point about the degree to which, like in the three-body problem, they seem to be able to step between us and our perception and deliver custom kind of experiences, I always think of the really amazing example that Valet has talked about, where this family was driving down the highway. 3 people in the car saw something, saw a UFO, but they each saw slightly different things. They were able to capture something on video, but it didn't look like what any of them saw. And on top of that, everybody else was acting as if they weren't seeing anything at the time. So you have multiple different deliveries of custom perceptual experiences, a lot like the three-body problem. So it's fascinating in terms of, again, not just the control they wield over our perception, but what that implies about the nature of reality itself.
All right, you teased it, and I want to know where you're going here. What are the weird things, the weirder things that are on this table here on the spectrum that kind of flow out of where we've taken the conversation so far? We got a few minutes, so I'm dying to get into this.
Okay, so this is elements that I have not discussed really on podcasts before because it is so out there. There's a couple different reasons that it is tricky material to get into. First of all, because it really stretches our believability quotient. It just seems like something that is just it's a bridge too far. But let's begin building the argument. If it's true that we recovered craft in the 1940s and 50s, we have had said material, said technology in our possession for 60 years or so, even longer, 70 years. And when that's the case, while we have heard arguments made from people like Lazar that the reason he was brought in is because we had not made much progress in trying to understand how this works and reverse engineer it. I don't think we should assume that that means that's the case across the board. Because, again, part of the trickiness here and part of the lore, and people like Stephen Greer have put this forward, again, some of Stephen Greer's own actions more recently have called into question how reliable he is as a witness. But again, he's even put forward other witnesses who've been part of these programs, these deeply Black programs, that are testifying to it firsthand. This notion that not only have there been accords made, not only have there been craft recovered, but there's some elements of these rogue programs have made so much progress and have stumbled across technologies that are so revolutionary, energy as well as propulsion and those kinds of things, that they have basically formed something like a breakaway civilization, or at least a group that's so rogue that they don't really have to be accountable to anyone, which relates to this notion you've heard about when power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So this is basically what you're stumbling across, is technology that's so revolutionary that it's centuries ahead of anything around you. And that would put you in a place where you could toy with the rest of the civilization. So the notion here is that some of the technology is so advanced that it also involves the hacking of space-time itself. We know from people like Tom DeLonge and other people, again, that are part of the lore, that there's this notion that it's not so much that they're coming from other places, but they're on this bandwidth of frequency, and by adjusting the frequency, you can interpenetrate with each other kind of thing. And even furthermore, that the notion that even time is something like that. It's just a different frequency, a different modulation, rather than this linear thing that's fixed. So if you know how to modulate that frequency, you can move across space-time, meaning time and space, of course. Again, that's one thing if the NHI can do that. But what if elements of the deeply Black programs have learned how to do that themselves, to the point where they can either create splintered timelines or be able to go far into the future and conduct affairs and then come back right to the moment you left, at the age you were when you left. Even Jason Sands kind of hinted at some of this in his own history. So here we have the notion, when he was asked in this space, this X space, if he thought 20 and back was a legitimate program. He didn't speak too much about it, and he didn't say it was necessarily that program per se or that name, but he said, and you could tell he was kind of struggling, wrestling with this, that he went through something as a young child, was involved in something that at least was similar enough to that it made him uncomfortable, and that made him claim that he thinks there's something to it, that clearly he's still working through. And when you listen to the witnesses, the people who've been supposedly victims of this program, you notice this happen. And this again speaks to John Mack, and what he noticed amongst these abductees is their bodily responses to him suggest that they had really gone through something traumatic, because you can't fake that with your body. In the same way, when you listen to some of these witnesses who talk about being victims of the secret space program, you see in their bodies that clearly they've experienced something traumatic. And part of the lore here is that there's even a fracturing of the human psyche. So we've seen evidence of this in Nazi history, where people were basically creating experiments to create sort of perfect soldiers that could be given orders, that could be given programming that would make them do exactly what they're told to do, and that this would be segmented, compartmented in their mind to the degree to which they wouldn't even know about it necessarily. Again, Manchurian candidate kind of territory here. So the notion here is that there's been this major advance made in a pretty dark way in terms of being able to fracture the human psyche in ways that you can keep part of people's history even from them, right? So we see this already happening with the phenomenon in terms of people who have missing time or people who have screen memories. But again, what if some elements of the military-industrial complex have developed some of those technologies? Not because they were necessarily given to them as gifts, but just that they've learned enough through experimentation and what they've discovered from coming across some of these platforms and these technologies to learn how to do this. Because the claims made from the secret space program include things like activities that are going on other planets as we speak, that any notion of our contemporary space program with Elon Musk and those kind of things and SpaceX is incredibly primitive technology that hides the fact that we have really next-gen technology, beyond next-gen, where you could, for instance, walk through a door and you're suddenly on a different planet, or you're in a different timeline, or you're in a splintered timeline. I know people that I've talked to that have been the abductees from the 90s who talk about, in addition to having positive, benevolent experiences with NHI, even though they were initially shocking, they've also been involved in programs that seem to be run by human beings, a separate program that they've also been taken into, where some pretty dark things were conducted there that seem to want to try to fracture and control the human psyche. And perhaps we again have heard about this notion from people like Gary Nolan, that there are biomarkers that indicate who the experiencers are. We have Dan Sherman's testimony saying that elements of the military-industrial complex knew who was being abducted and when and where. What if, again, there has been advances made to the degree to which they can target these people, end up using them in nefarious ways, and perhaps even confuse some of these abductees so they have a hard time noting which group was taking them, sometimes involving the military-industrial complex or, again, rogue elements of it. And again, the full breadth of this involves being able to go into the future, carry on activities there for sometimes decades. People actually testify to that you're brought back to the moment you left, and it might be as a young child, and you're very controllable, you're very malleable. There's an understanding of consciousness, even the innocence and the malleability of that incredibly powerful energy that a child has that is used for nefarious means. You think about what the military has been willing to do at times in order to dominate the enemy and to create a better technology, to weaponize technology, even consciousness technology. These are the things that are on the table. The last thing I'll say about it is part of the reason why it's so tricky is you have some pretty questionable characters claiming some of these things. I don't mean so much the people themselves who claim they've been through this, but you have certain, I'm not going to name them, but certain people who've written books about these things and talked about that, where you see this overlap with notions like QAnon, where you begin to question these people's ability to critically think and recognize what is fact from fiction. That's part of the problem, and that might even be part of the design, is that you deliberately feed people misinformation, disinformation in the midst of some truth nuggets so that everybody gets confused, everybody dismisses it as just more of that nonsense. And it protects you from being able to carry on these things that happen in a different space-time, so they're not things you can find evidence for in the same way that the phenomenon does that to some degree. And the notions are so beyond what we're willing to accept that no one really pays that much of a close attention anyway.
Yeah, all right. So I'm picking my jaw off the floor. It's a lot to take in. Far more than we can get into at the end of this episode, but I agree with you. There's a lot of interesting threads to follow there. And absolutely, some of those ideas are certainly on the table if we go through the steps that we went through during the episode and kind of follow some of the conclusions. It feels, in a way, though, to some degree, for me sitting here right now, and I want to revisit this feeling, like it feels difficult to process. It's so much, right? Because it kind of leaves a person wondering, what foundation is there to reliably stand on? What facts are facts at all? And which, it kind of is the place where you would fall if you do buy into the idealist perspective. If reality is more dreamscape-like, and you start understanding that it might be like that rather than what we've been taught, then a lot of different things become incredibly plausible, and that it's more of a kind of a meaning-making connections that dictate what happens in quote-unquote reality than this sort of A, B, C, sort of paradigm that we've been given. So it's a lot to process. I'm going to be processing some of this for a while, and I want to revisit it because I think it's going to be a good conversation fodder for future shows. I would love to hear from folks on the comments on this episode, what people think about this. I know we've got listeners who are right on board with that, and some who are, maybe getting ready to push that, stop button. But I think it'd be good feedback to hear. So I really appreciate you sharing that. It's a lot to take in.
It is. And the last thing I'll say on a positive note, an encouraging note, is that what you also hear as part of that lore, as well as other aspects of the lore, is that human beings are incredibly powerful, much more powerful than we realize. That if we could fully rock our consciousness potential, we would be amazed by our ability to not only resolve many of the problems in the world, but also to be able to, again, work with technologies at that level of consciousness. And furthermore, again, as I've been saying for a long time now, because we are fractal impressions of source consciousness itself, We basically have all the secrets of the universe within ourselves. So the idea here is that part of the campaign used by some of these control structures, whether some of the less than fully benevolent NHI or elements of the military-industrial complex or the human elites that want to control us, really they can only do so if they keep deceiving us about our potential. If we actually wake up, we step into our potential. Again, people like Chris Bledsoe have talked about this. The lady said, humankind needs to recognize who they are. They need to up their game in terms of consciousness awareness. If they do, it will change the world for the better. This fits in with, again, religious lore, traditions that talk about 1,000 years of peace if we can fully make this upgrade in consciousness. So this is on the table too. So as much as some of this stuff feels dark and overwhelming, I would say it pales in comparison to the potential we have, which is sitting right in front of us. And it could be, again, the argument I've been making is that the very complex of forces coming together could make us aware of that would allow us to actually take that step. And in some ways, that would be a better scenario than if we just keep stumbling on as we have been, which has left us really underwhelmed in terms of our potential and our future. This could actually transform our future. So I want to leave people with that as well.
Yes, cheers to that transformation, 100%. That's the kind of future, the reality that I want to be a part of. It's very exciting to consider. Well, thank you all for listening to this episode. It's been quite a conversation. Looking forward to future conversations where we unpack these ideas even further. Please do us a favor by giving us a like and subscribe. It helps the show. And we hope to see you out there in the community. May the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.